Loved You Better Than You Knew by Mrs. McVeigh Miller. Copyright 1897, now in the public domain. Chapter 14. Parted at the Altar. Dr. Sprague, the minister, had noticed on entering that a tall, stately lady in a long traveling wrap stood at one of the windows, looking down absently on the busy avenue. It was, in fact, Mrs. Varian, who had arrived but a few minutes ago, and was waiting in the parlor until her room should be made ready. Tortured by a cruel unrest after her interview of the evening before with Everard Dawn, she had decided to leave Idlewild for a few days until after he went away with his daughter. Her mind was quite easy over the breaking up of the untoward love affair, as Arthur had written her a note earlier in the day saying he was off on a short trip with a friend and would wire particulars tomorrow. On learning from Mr. Dawn that he had rejected Arthur's suit for his daughter's hand, she guessed readily enough that her boy had gone away to drown his sorrow. She was glad of this, believing that change of scenery is a great panacea for hopeless grief. Acting on this idea herself, she determined to make a short journey to Washington and perhaps New York, in the hope of obliterating from her mind certain painful impressions produced, or rather renewed on it, by the encounter with Everard Dawn at Idlewild. The man's face and voice haunted her and brought back memories fraught with pain. To escape them, she had fled from her home that stormy night to seek respite and nepenthe. I would not dig my past, up from its grave of weakness and regret, up from its hopes that glimmered but to set, its dreams that did not last. Absorbed in painful thought, she had not observed the entrance of anyone until the raised voice of the minister made her look over her shoulder in cold inquiry. "I shall need 2 witnesses, please. Perhaps that lady looking out of the window would oblige us." Then the host advanced toward her, saying courteously, "Madam, will you honor us by becoming the witness to a ceremony of marriage?" Mrs. Varian inclined her proud, dark head in assent, and moved gracefully forward toward the young couple who stood before the minister, the girl bashful and trembling, the man pale, but with an eager smile on his handsome face. The next moment, a startled cry rang on the air. "Arthur!" The young man dropped Cynthia's hand and looked around. "Mother!" in surprise. "Oh, Arthur, what is the meaning of this strange scene?" she cried, coming up between him and Cinthia. The young man laughed easily, soon getting over his surprise, and answered, "It means, mother, that Mr. Dawn refused to give me Cinthia, so we took the bit between our teeth and ran away. But how came you here? You did not pursue us, did you, dear?" No, for I did not dream of this. I made up my mind last night to come to Washington on a little business trip while you were away. When did you arrive?" "Just a few minutes ago, and I thought we had better get married before we registered or even had breakfast, for fear Mr. Dawn might be on our track." "We must have traveled on the same train. How strange we did not meet. How fortunate that we meet now!" she cried with almost tragic emphasis. "Yes, mother, for now you can witness our marriage and give us your blessing. Cinthia, dear, shake hands with my mother." Cinthia put out a little trembling hand and looked timidly out of the corner of her drooping eyes at the beautiful lady. She met a cold glance, and the hand that just touched hers without the slightest pressure was icy. "Are you ready now?" asked the minister, again opening his book. "Yes," answered Arthur, taking Cynthia's hand and turning to him eagerly. But there came a low, heart-wrung cry from the mother's lips. "Wait!" All turned toward her in surprise. Her eyes were like coals of fire, her face wore a bluish pallor, her very white lips were white as she uttered hoarsely, "I beg pardon, but the ceremony must not go on until I speak to Arthur." Every word came jerkily between the pallid lips, and her outstretched hand clutched Arthur's arm. "Come with me. Let me speak to you alone," she implored. Every one realized that she was laboring under the most terrible agitation. It seemed plain to all that she meant to forbid the marriage. Arthur frowned at her, the son whose wishes she had never thwarted, and exclaimed impatiently, "Can you not wait till the ceremony is over? Remember, Mr. Don may come at any moment." "No, I cannot wait. Come," eagerly. "I will not detain you long. Miss Dawn, will you not wait here just a few moments while I tell Arthur the truth?" "Go, Arthur," answered the girl faintly, and she sunk upon a chair, trembling in every limb, sure in her heart that something was going to happen. Mrs. Varian was angry with her, she was sure. How coldly she had looked at her, how reluctantly she had touched her hand with icy fingers. Mrs. Varian dragged Arthur away with her to her own room, and then the genial host said kindly, in sympathy for the suffering girl, "I will send a maid to show you to a room to rest, Miss Dawn, while you are waiting for your friends." "Oh, I thank you," she answered gratefully, desperately glad to be alone. When she was gone, the minister said uneasily, "I do not believe there is any use in my waiting. There will be no marriage if that proud Mrs. Varian can have her own way." "You are right," returned the host. "I could see plainly that she intended to break off the marriage. I believe that she pursued them here, instead of just meeting them by accident as she pretended. I never heard of such a coincidence. I suppose the girl is poor, as her clothing was plain and cheap, and the mother and son are rich. In fact, I know they are, because the young fellow has stayed here several times before, and he throws money about like a young prince. He said that her father had refused him her hand, so he must be a very black sheep, as poor men are usually glad to welcome a rich son-in-law," said the minister, adding, "I believe I had better go, if you think I shall not be needed. I am sorry for that sweet young girl, for I am sure that proud lady will show her no mercy. If you are needed, I will send to the parsonage for you, but it would be a surprise to me if the marriage comes off now," the host said candidly. So presently the minister went away, rather disappointed at losing the expected liberal wedding fee. Cinthia locked herself into the luxurious room and laid aside her hat and jacket, so that she might bathe her face and neck and brush out the golden waves of her beautiful hair. When she had finished, she gazed at herself in the long mirror and saw an exquisitely beautiful young creature, although her face was pale and there were dark circles under her heavy eyes, caused by the excitement and emotion of the last 36 hours. She sunk into a large easy chair and waited, with a wildly throbbing heart, for the end of the interview between Arthur and his mother. She had a lurking presentiment of evil. It had fallen on her at the touch of Mrs. Varian's cold hand, and the strange glance of her eyes, so different from her sweet friendliness the night she had been her guest at Idlewild. Yet Arthur had said his mother was pleased at their engagement. What could it all mean? The lids drooped over her tired young eyes, and in spite of her anxiety, weariness overcame her, and she fell into a heavy sleep. So she did not have to undergo the suspense of waiting, for more than half an hour passed away before there came a low, half-deprecating rap upon the door. It startled Cinthia, and she sprung awake, looking about her in confusion, before she comprehended her position. The rap came again, and a little impatiently, so she hastily opened the door to Mrs. Varian, saying, "Pardon me if I have kept you waiting. I was fatigued with travel and fell asleep." Chapter 15. An Eternal Farewell. "I am glad you could sleep," Mrs. Varian answered, as she stepped across the threshold and confronted the lovely girl whose heart she was about to wound so cruelly. But somehow she did not shrink from the task, for a change had come over her feelings toward Cinthia, and she experienced a sort of fierce pleasure in the task now before her. In a way, it would be taking revenge on a woman who had wronged Mrs. Varian, and who was dead now, dead, but unforgiven in her lonely grave. For this girl, her daughter, how could Mrs. Varian cherish any love? Perhaps something like pity touched her heart as the large, soft, dark eyes turned upon her so wistfully, but she fought down the sympathy, saying to herself, "Her mother had no mercy on me, none, and the same blood runs in Cynthia's veins. She could not be trusted to bring her husband anything but ill." She threw back her magnificent head with a haughty motion and said curtly, "Sit down, Cinthia, for what I am about to tell you may possibly ruffle your nerves." Cinthia obeyed with surprising meekness for one so proud, but the imperious woman before her had the habit of command, and everyone seemed to obey. She, too, took a chair, as if perhaps her own nerves were not quite steady. Then she said, "Cinthia, you have done wrong in disobeying your father's commands when he told you there were reasons why you should not marry my son." Cinthia bowed without answering. She had no defense to make, only the mute protest of her wistful eyes. "I am here to tell you," continued Mrs. Varian, "that on my side there exist as grave reasons as your father's for protesting against your marrying Arthur." The blood rose in the girl's face, mounted to her fair brow, and receded, leaving her pale as death, her eyes beginning to flash with pride. She essayed to speak, and faltered. "Arthur told me that you were pleased with our engagement. I did not think it mattered much, disobeying a cold, unloving father who has neglected me all my life. If he had been fond of me, kind to me, I would have acted differently." A strange gleam shot into the brilliant eyes of Mrs. Varian, almost as if it pleased her to know that Everard Dawn had been cold and cruel to his only daughter. Then she looked down and played with the diamonds that flashed on her white hands, as she continued, gravely, "Arthur and I have talked matters over together. There are things we would rather not confide to you, best for you not to hear, and we have decided that your father is right. You can never be Arthur's wife." Perhaps Cinthia had expected something like this, but it struck her with the force of a great shock. She began to tremble like a leaf in a gale, crying out, "You do not mean that he, Arthur, rejects me after bringing me away from my father's home to marry me, jilts me at the very altar?" It was piteous. That heart cry wrung from the profoundest depths of feeling, and for a moment Mrs. Varian was silent, sympathetic. Then she looked down again at her rings and answered, "I beg that you will not blame Arthur. He is the soul of honor, but in this matter he has no choice save to give back your promise." "He sent you to tell me this? Why was he not brave enough to come himself?" "He believed it was better not to see you again," the lady answered, and Cinthia gasped in a sort of terror. Not to see him again, her Arthur, her love, her king, who was just now to have been her happy bridegroom. Why, this was too terrible to believe. Parted in an hour, torn asunder at the altar by the cruelty of those cold hearts that age and time had taught forgetfulness of love. Why, this was too hard to bear. It seemed to her that she was swooning, dying. The same sick feeling came to her that she had felt last night, when her father's voice shouted to them in the blackness of the night. But a sudden hope, a lightning suspicion, restored her fainting senses, and she sat erect again. I, she began incoherently. "Oh, Mrs. Varian, it would break my heart to believe the cruel thing you have just said. My Arthur, mine, who is to be my husband, to turn against me all in one moment, to wish never to see me again. You are deceiving me. I will not believe such an impossible story save from his own lips." With that passionate defiance, she lay back pale and panting, gazing with half-shut eyes at her tormentor. "Is it so?" said Mrs. Varian. "Then you shall be satisfied. It was only to spare you and Arthur pain, but perhaps it will please you to hear that he suffers as much as you do over this pang of parting." There came to her the first intimation of an unsuspected nobility in the girl's nature when Cinthia uttered, drearily, "It would be cruel, nay, wicked, in me to wish anyone to feel the agony of soul that is my portion." "Yet Arthur shares it with you, child, to the deepest, bitterest dregs. Come with me and see." She took Cynthia's cold, unresisting hand and led her along the corridor, continuing in an explanatory manner, "He should have come to you, but the shock of his broken love dream almost stretched him dead at my feet. I had to call in a physician, but he is better now." She pushed open a door and led Cinthia in. She saw Arthur lying on a lounge, with a ghastly face and closed eyes. "Are you asleep, my son? Because, after all, it will be better for you to tell Cinthia yourself. She cannot believe me." He started and opened his dark blue eyes. When they fell on the placid, sorrowful face of his lost little love, the burning tears sparkled into them and rolled down upon his cheeks. Years of anguish could not have changed him more than this keen stroke of an hour ago. "Cinthia," he breathed hollowly, and she came and bent over him, impulsively slipping her little hand into his as he went on. "Cinthia, do not think me false or fickle, or turned against you by the arbitrary wishes of our parents. I never loved you better than in this hour, when I must part from you forever. Cinthia, it is the most fortunate thing in the world that my mother chanced on us in time to prevent our mad marriage. A great gulf is fixed between us that neither our love nor our hopes can ever cross. My mother has telegraphed for your father to come and take you home, and we must bid each other an eternal farewell." Cinthia felt herself sinking, falling, but an arm slipped round her waist, and Mrs. Varian, with a sigh, pillowed the unconscious head against her breast. Chapter 16. Oh, what a time! Mrs. Flint was at her wits' end to know what to do for the strange woman whom her brother had mistakenly brought home as his daughter. The upshot was that she simply did nothing at all but to sit still and stare, and wonder where the woman came from, how Everard came to bring her home, and what had become of Cinthia. Presently she heard steps and voices, and rushed to the door, glad that her vigil with the seemingly dead woman was ended. Everard Dawn, alarmed at the duration of Cynthia's swoon, had brought a physician with him, and exclaimed as soon as he saw his sister, "Has Cinthia recovered yet?" "You can see for yourself," she answered in a dazed way as she ushered them into the room. The two men, almost blinded by the brightness of the room after the outer storm and darkness, advanced to the sofa and bent over the patient in keen anxiety, while Mrs. Flint blurted out nervously, "Everard, what is the matter? Why did you bring that strange woman here instead of Cinthia?" At the same moment the old doctor added, "It is not little Cinthia, but a stranger." Everard Dawn bent down with an air of incredulity that quickly changed as he saw what a terrible mistake he had made. The cry that rose from his tortured heart, the baffled purpose, the agony, the pain, rang forever in the ears of the two who heard it. Then exhausted nature gave way. He fell writhing to the floor in convulsions. Then Mrs. Flint and the doctor had their hands full with the two patients. They ignored the strange woman until Mr. Dawn had been quieted and removed to his bed, where the doctor kept him quiescent by the use of opiates while he turned his attention to his other charge. "Who is she? Where did she come from? I've never seen her face around here," he said curiously to Mrs. Flint, who replied by confiding in him all that she knew, which, of course, threw no light upon the mystery. So without more ado they set to work to restore the poor creature to life. It was a serious undertaking, and lasted until the gray dawn of another dreary day glimmered in through the windows of the sitting-room. Then the woman lay asleep, having recovered sufficiently to open her eyes, stare at them uncomprehendingly, and to swallow some broth with the avidity produced by starvation. Poor soul! It is the want of food that has brought her to this pass. See how flabby her flesh is, and how loosely it hangs on her large frame. Look at her shabby worn clothing, not much better than a tramp's, and her broken shoes, how pitiful! It is doubtful if she survives even after the long spell of sickness that threatens her," said the doctor. "Good land, doctor, a long spell, you say? Why, what are you going to do about it? Can't she be sent to the almshouse?" "I was a stranger, and ye took me in," quoted the old physician reverently. The old lady thus referred to her Bible, muttered repentantly, "Lord, forgive my hardness of heart. I'll do the best I can, Dr. Savoy, but I'm an old woman, and the nursing will go hard with me, you see, along with my other troubles." "You shall have help. There are plenty good women willing to help you," he replied, and rose to go, adding, "I will go and bring one right away." "Get me a trained nurse, doctor. I'll pay the cost. For what with Everard and her sick on my hands, I'll need skilled help." "Oh, Mr. Dunn will be up and about in 24 hours, I believe, and out and gone after his eloping daughter. You need not give him any more of that opiate, and he will be awake for his breakfast. Tell him to remain quiet in his room till I call again this afternoon." So saying, the good old physician bustled out and away, and he did not leave Mrs. Flint long alone with her burden of perplexities and worry, but directly sent to her the best nurse the neighborhood afforded, a stout middle-aged woman, with a keen eye and cheery smile, who at once took on her younger shoulders the burden of Mrs. Flint's care. Together they arranged a tiny hall bedroom, all there was to spare, and removed the sleeping woman to the comfortable bed. "Now, Mrs. Flint, you go and lie down. You look dead beat, that's a fact," the nurse said compassionately. "I must start my kitchen fire and have a bit of breakfast first. Afterward I'll rest." When the breakfast was over, she stole into her brother's room, but he was still sleeping heavily from the drug Dr. Savoy had administered. Mrs. Flint went to her room and snatched 2 hours of rest, from which she was aroused by an impatient rapping on the door. "Mercy sakes, who can that be?" she ejaculated, making haste to answer the summons. She opened the door and found a telegraph messenger with a message for her brother. He ran away, shivering in the cold air, as soon as she had signed the receipt. Mrs. Flint turned it over in her shaking hands, soliloquizing, "From Washington, to tell us, of course, that they're married. Oh, dear, what a time!" And she hurried to her brother's room. To her surprise, she found him up and dressed, putting the finishing touches to his toilette. The tears rushed to her eyes at the sight of his haggard, miserable face. "Rebecca, I was fooled last night. Arthur Varian gave me that tramp he had picked up in the road for my own child, and I let him deceive me. But I shall go on their tracks at once," he said weakly. For answer, she held out the telegram. He snatched it with a cry of anguish and quickly mastered the contents. His face changed marvelously, and he exclaimed hoarsely, "Thank God!" and tossed her the telegram. She read, "Cinthia is here safe with me and not married. Please come at once and take her home. Mrs. Varian." The address was carefully given, and the man's face, from anger and distress, changed to keenest joy. "This is better than I could have hoped," he cried. "Can you give me some breakfast at once, Rebecca, for I must leave for Washington on the earliest train." Chapter 17. A Deadly Feud. When Cinthia recovered her senses, she found herself lying on her bed, and the air was heavy with the scent of eau de cologne, with which Mrs. Varian was gently bathing her face and hands. "Do you feel better now?" the lady gently inquired, and Cinthia mechanically answered, "Oh, yes." In fact, her head was aching wretchedly, and her heart was heavy as lead. But she would seek no sympathy from Arthur Varian's mother, who had turned against her so cruelly. "I am glad to hear it. Perhaps you will feel like taking breakfast now," touching the bell. "Oh, no, no, no!" cried Cinthia, feeling as if she could never swallow a morsel of food again. "But yes," returned Mrs. Varian, smiling, as she rose as if to go. Cinthia raised her heavy head and held out a deprecatory hand. "You are going," she said, "and it is not likely that we shall ever meet again. Wait till I ask you one question. Why is it that you hate me?" "I do not hate you, child." "Why deny it when I have read it in your eyes?" cried the girl accusingly. Mrs. Varian's face worked with emotion, and she started forward as if she would have embraced the girl, then suddenly drew back, saying huskily, "Cinthia, you are mistaken. I do not hate you. It was your mother." "My mother!" the girl gasped in bewilderment, gazing in wonder at the beautiful and agitated face of the lady. Mrs. Varian continued hoarsely, "My feelings toward you are complex, Cinthia. For your own sake I could love you. You are beautiful and winning, but between your parents and me there has been a deadly feud. They both wronged me. I have hated them both for years and years, and that hatred comes between you and me, child, like an impassable gulf. That first night I saw you I did not guess at your parentage, hence my attraction to you. When I learned the truth upon the return of your father, my feelings changed. I do not deny it. I could not contemplate with any calmness the thought of a marriage between you and Arthur. Now ask me no more. I have said more than I intended to do, and can reveal nothing further of that past which lies like a dead weight on my happiness. I must leave you to return to my son, but I will come back when you have had your breakfast served to you, and Cinthia was sitting up on the side of the bed, her hair a disheveled tangle of gold about her pallid face, with its great star-like eyes. They flashed with sudden pride now as she interrupted. Let me beg you to remain away, nor seek to cross again the gulf that you say yawns between us. I am better alone with my humiliation. Bitterly. Do not call it that, Cinthia. You do not understand, and I must take charge of you until your father comes, insisted Mrs. Varian. I prefer to remain alone. It would appear cruel in me to leave you like this, seemingly forlorn and friendless. Cinthia laughed mirthlessly and reiterated, I prefer to wait alone for my father. Very well, I must bow to your will. God bless you, my poor girl. And the haughty woman moved with a stately step from the room. Cinthia threw herself back upon the bed with closed eyes and pallid lips. The agony of that moment no pen could describe. Was it only 2 days ago she had been wishing for something to occur and break up the monotony of her life, and resenting Mrs. Flint's homilies upon her discontent? Something had happened with a vengeance. The love that had nestled in her heart that day, a shy, sweet newcomer, had been fanned into strong, passionate life by hurrying events that now closed round her like a grasp of steel threatening to crush out all the sweetness of life forever. She had tasted the sweetness of loving and being loved, she who had been lonely and heart-hungry for so long. But now the sweet cup of joy was dashed from her lips, and bitter dregs offered in its stead. They had parted her from her heart's love, Arthur. With his own lips that so lately had sworn eternal fealty to her, he had uttered the edict of their eternal separation, for no cause save that their parents cherished an old feud. It was cruel, bitter, and Cynthia's heart hardened with rebellion against her fate. She longed desperately for death to end the agony of love and humiliation under which she suffered. Oh, if I could just slip away out of life now, this moment, she cried, in fierce intolerance of her pain, and a lightning temptation came to her to end it all. She began to pace restlessly up and down the room, wondering what would be the easiest way to take her own life, her life that was so unbearable now. It would be so easy to close all the apertures for air, turn on the gas, and lie down on her bed until asphyxiation came to her relief and wrenched life out of its suffering frame. I wonder if it would be painful. I don't want to suffer, she said to herself, with keen physical shrinking, while her active mind pictured the scene when they should come to seek her and find her cold and dead, her cruel father, fickle Arthur, and his revengeful mother, who, for the sake of an old-time wrong, was willing to break two fond young hearts. What keen remorse would pierce their hearts when they saw that they had driven her to desperation and death! Perhaps they would repent when it was all too late. At the moving thought, Cinthia dissolved into floods of tears. She knelt down by a chair with her head on her arm, and heavy sobs shook her slight frame like a reed in the wind. She cried out that she wished she had never seen Arthur Varian, who had taught her the sweet meaning of love, only to make her more lonely and wretched than she had been before. But a rap on the door made her start up in alarm and hastily dash away her tears, before she opened it to a white-clad waiter bearing a tray containing a dainty breakfast, which he arranged on a little table, then withdrew. Then Cinthia, in spite of her grief, discovered that she was unromantically hungry. On yesterday, while sulking in her chamber at home, she had refused food all day, and on the train last night had only taken some fruit. The appetizing aroma of hot rolls, broiled birds, and steaming chocolate began to appeal to her irresistibly. and she ended by drawing up a chair and making a tolerable meal for a girl who thought her heart was broken and was actually contemplating suicide. She did not feel half so morbid when she finished her chocolate. Life was bitter still, but death did not seem so desirable. Her first temptation to suicide changed to a thought of flight. What if I should slip away and hide myself in the great world where they could never find me again? I might make a career for myself, become a great actress maybe, and when they saw me successful on the stage, they would think I had forgotten cruel Arthur, as I wish them to do, for I would not have him think I love him still. She thought bitterly, her mind running on novels she had read in which romantic girls, thrown alone on the world, had encountered wonderful adventures and finally carved their names on the rock of love. Cinthia was utterly wretched and despairing, and in the mood for anything reckless. She flung on her hat and jacket and turned toward the door. She was actually going to venture out into the world alone, a desperate victim whom fate had used most cruelly, and who longed to escape from everything she had known into some new, untried sphere. She had no idea where she was going. She would escape into the street and wander aimlessly up and down with the busy throngs. That was just now her only thought. She stretched out her hand to the doorknob, and at the instant a light rap on the outside startled her. "It is Mrs. Varian, but she cannot forbid my going," she thought defiantly, and flung wide the door. A stranger stood on the threshold. A lovely woman, richly dressed, faint, delicate perfume exhaling from her silks and furs. "Ah, you are going out? I beg pardon, but will you permit me to enter your room for a moment? I have lately occupied it, in fact only went away this morning, and I have discovered that I forgot 2 of my rings," she exclaimed in a sweet, silvery voice like liquid music. Cinthia stood aside to let her enter, and, floating to the dressing case, she lifted the scarf and displayed 2 sparkling rings. "See, it is fortunate that the chambermaid is honest, or that she did not discover these. I thank you for your courtesy. But excuse me, you were going out. My dear young lady, are you feeling well? I assure you that you look extremely ill, and there is a sharp east wind blowing outside. You are trembling. Your face is as pale as chalk. Your beautiful hair is all in disorder. You ought to be in bed with your mother watching over you." "My mother, alas!" cried Cinthia, and again her slight form shook with a tempest of sobs and tears that startled the handsome stranger, who forced her gently into a chair. Meanwhile, Everard Dawn was speeding to Washington on the fastest train. He arrived there at dusk and took a cab to the hotel where Mrs. Varian was staying, immediately sending up his card to that lady and receiving a summons to her private parlor. She was waiting there alone, and their greeting was cold and formal, though she could not help noting the signs of last night's agitation on his pale face. Waving him to a seat, she recounted briefly all that had transpired since their meeting yesterday. "I came away last night. Frankly, I could not breathe the same air with you, and I found them here. It was one of the greatest shocks of my life," she said, and he bowed coldly. She continued stiffly. "She is here waiting for you, but in a most rebellious mood. In fact, forbade me to re-enter her room today, so she must have spent a lonely time, poor girl. But before you go to her, Arthur wishes an interview with you on a very particular subject relating to Cinthia. You will find him alone in there," indicating a door. Everard looked fixedly at her a moment, then bowed and left her standing there, while he went in to Arthur Varian. Chapter 18. Remember that I loved you well. The beautiful stranger pushed Cinthia gently into a chair and sat down by her side. "I hope you will not think me intruding, my dear girl, but you inspire me with a strange interest. Are you here alone?" she cried earnestly. "Alone," answered Cinthia in a tragic tone, as she lifted her anguished dark eyes and scanned the other's face. She beheld one of the sweetest, fairest faces she had ever beheld. The lady might have been 35 or more, but she possessed that charm of beauty that always suggests youth. Perfect features, a complexion fresh as the morning, large tender eyes of the brightest blue, and abundant tresses of shining golden brown hair, while a mouth like Cupid's bow in form and crimson as a rose revealed in a dazzling smile small pearly white teeth that added the last charm to her winsome loveliness. Cinthia gazed fixedly at that winning face, drew a long breath of emotion, and instantly became captive to beauty's bow and spear. She was irresistibly drawn to the graceful woman whose sweet silvery voice sounded like music in her ears as she exclaimed, "You are in trouble, dear. I feel it, see it in your pale face and sad eyes. I hear it in the anguish of your voice. And you are alone, you say. Then I dare not go and leave you like this, lest harm befall you. Let me help you." "No one can help me," Cinthia answered in stubborn despair, but all the while that voice and smile were thrilling her heart with subtle tenderness. "Then the case must indeed be serious," cried the lady, gently slipping her arm around Cynthia's waist, moved by an impulse she scarcely understood herself, while she continued gently, "My heart aches for your sorrow, dear, and although we are strangers to each other, I long to comfort you. Confide in me, and perhaps I can help you. Is it a question of lack of means, or, sadder still, of love?" "Of love!" burst out Cinthia, and she dropped her head on that silken shoulder in a passionate outburst of tears, won in spite of herself by the divine art of sympathy. And then, since both were strangely magnetically attracted to each other, it was not hard for her to draw from Cinthia the brief, sad story of her life and love, down to the very moment when she had opened the door to fly out into the street with the half-formed plan of suicide yet in her mind. Oh, what a pathetic, moving story it was, and how it touched the listener's tender heart, moving her to tears. She could sympathize with all that Cinthia told her, and could share in her resentment against her unloving father, her strict aunt, and the lover whose affection had not been proof against the schemes of his proud mother. To her eyes, as to Cynthia's, it all looked as if Mrs. Varian and Everard Dawn had made of the hapless lovers a sacrifice to a family feud vaguely hinted at in the lady's confession to Cinthia that her mother had been her bitterest enemy and was unforgiven in her grave. With all her heart she espoused Cynthia's side, and freely expressed contempt for Arthur's part in the girl's sorrow. "He has acted the part of a coward, forsaking you thus at the command of his haughty mother, and I would think no more of him, dear, for he is not worth it," she exclaimed warmly. Cinthia only sighed. She did not believe now that she could ever put Arthur out of her thoughts. In spite of his seeming injustice to her, and the humiliation he had put upon her, something in her heart vaguely pleaded in his defense. Perhaps his illness and pallor, and the keen anguish of his voice when he had said to her so sadly that they must bid each other an eternal farewell. There had been something solemn, even tragic in that parting, almost like the farewell of death. Resentment did not have any part in its supreme despair. It was rather, as those who love are parted by the hand of death, and one stands hushed with reverent breath, gazing on funeral bier and pall, but ere we close the coffin lid, let bitter memories all be hid. If memory needs must break the spell, remember that I loved you well, and o'er the rest let silence fall. The lovely stranger continued earnestly, "You are young yet, and in time a new love may replace this lost one and bring you great happiness." "Happiness is not for me. I am ill-fated," moaned Cinthia. "Do not feel so despondent. The young are naturally morbid. I know that by experience. I have had a great sorrow in my own life, and overlived it." Cinthia looked at her almost incredulously. She seemed so fair and bright, and her inexperienced eyes could not read the signs of a past grief in the delicate lines about the lips and eyes. "I have overlived it, and so will you," repeated the lady. "Tell me how to do it. Help me." cried Cinthia appealingly, and as the lady remained gravely silent a moment, she added, "Oh, if I could be filled with some great excitement that would occupy my thoughts, I believe I could put him out of my mind, except in very quiet moments. I was thinking just before you came in that I would like to go on the stage, to become a great actress." An expression of dismay lowered over the fair face regarding her so intently, as Cinthia continued eagerly, "As we came to the hotel this morning, I saw through the carriage windows large posters announcing the appearance of a great actress tonight and this afternoon in a popular play. I have been thinking of her, and that I would like to live such a life. Do you think if I tried that I might succeed?" "Ah, child, you do not know what labor and trouble would be involved in such an undertaking." "I should not care for that. It would be what I need to turn my thoughts away from Arthur. And indeed, the desire has taken hold on me, fascinates me. I intend to try." "No, dear, you must not do it. It is not wise nor desirable. I am glad that I happened in on you this morning, for there is no one more capable of advising you in this crisis of your life. I tell you, stage work is heartache and sorrow, even when crowned with a little success such as Madame Ray's, whose name you read on the posters this morning. I tell you this, and I ought to know, for I am that woman." "You?" Cinthia cried, wide-eyed and wondering, and with a sad smile. The other answered, "Yes." Taking Cynthia's hand and caressing it softly in both her own, she added, "When I was young like you, I had a great sorrow that sent my thoughts wandering, like yours, in search of a sensation in which to drown memory and grief. I turned to the stage, and after a period of drudgery and patience most painful to remember, earned a measure of success. So I am in a position to know what I am talking about, and to advise you against the course that I myself adopted. Not for worlds, my dear, would I have you go on the stage. No, no. It is a feverish life in the glare of the footlights. When I am rich enough to live without my work, I shall immediately retire to a private life." But she saw that her words had not convinced Cinthia. The feverish fascination was still in her mind, the longing to escape from the painful present into something new and strange. But she persevered. "If you will listen to me, dear child, you will yield to your father's wish to place you in school for 2 years. Believe me, the course of study will be far less hard than the training for the stage. Suppose you come with me now to our rehearsal and remain for our matinee performance. It will give you a glimpse of theatrical life behind the scenes that may perhaps turn your mind from this fascination." "I will be glad to go with you," answered Cinthia, eager for escape from the wretched present, and with strange reluctance to part from the charming actress. "We will go at once, then," said Madame Ray, rising and adding, "Perhaps you should ask Mrs. Varian's leave." "I shall do nothing of the kind," Cinthia answered rebelliously. "I have told her I wish to be alone, and she will not even know I am gone." "But your father might arrive." "He cannot do so until very late, and I will probably be back when he comes," Cinthia answered, but wishing in her heart that she were going this moment so far out of her old life that she need never encounter her father again, the stern, unloving father for whom she did not pretend an affection. Chapter 19. A Tragic Past. The actress did not urge her any further. Taking her hand as fondly as if she had been her own daughter, she led her from the room down to her waiting carriage. At dusk that evening she had not returned, and when Everard Dawn went to seek her, in company with Mrs. Varian, they found the room untenanted. Mr. Dawn had come out of Arthur's room with a pale, agitated face, and a look about the eyes that in a woman would have betokened recent tears. It had, in fact, been a most emotional interview, and one from which he was glad to escape. But the softness of his expression gave place to pride and coldness when he saw Mrs. Varian waiting for him, and he said with a haughtiness that equaled her own, "Will you have the kindness to conduct me to Cinthia?" She wondered why he did not say, "my daughter," instead of Cinthia, but it pleased her nevertheless, the indifference he showed toward his child. She was selfish enough to feel glad that he had no love for the daughter of the woman who had been her enemy in life, and whose sin against her had been too heinous for any possibility of forgiveness. With a slight bow of assent, she moved on by his side to Cynthia's room, where she knocked several times without receiving any answer. With a sudden misgiving at the memory of the girl's desperate mood that morning, she opened the door and looked inside. "Good heavens! She is gone!" Turning to him with startled eyes, he answered sternly, rebukingly, "She should not have been left alone, but of course I could not expect you to watch over her mother's daughter." Her great eyes flashed in her pale face as she retorted, "I certainly had no cause to love her, but I would not wish her any ill. We had better inquire about her down at the office." They did so, and were startled and mystified by the news that Madame Ray, the actress, had called on Miss Dawn that morning and soon afterward took her away with her in the carriage. "The lady is playing at the Metropolitan Theater. Perhaps the young lady has gone to the matinee," said the polite clerk, wondering at their blank faces. Yes, of course," Mr. Dawn returned, unwilling to make his perturbation known. He turned away with Mrs. Varian, saying to her in an undertone, "I will go in search of her, and you had better keep this news from Arthur." "I will," she answered, and he left her with a slight, cold bow. She stood still in the corridor and watched him out of sight with a stony gaze ere she retreated to her own room and sunk half fainting upon a chair, murmuring, "Ah, cruel fate that made him cross my path again! Was I not wretched enough already?" Whatever there had been in the past between those two, it had surely been most tragic, judging by their present scorn of each other and their impatience of the fate that had brought them together again. For more than an hour she crouched in her chair with drooping head and a gray ashen face, from which her great burning eyes shone like live coals. Then she rose and stared at herself in the long mirror, muttering bleakly, "What a wreck I look after one of those spells, wan and gray, like a woman aged in an hour. It would frighten Arthur to see me like this, and he would surely guess at the hidden fires that slumber, volcano-like in my breast, eating away love and hope and joy. He must not see me thus." And with the aid of cosmetics skillfully applied, she soon hid the traces of the passion storm that had swept with devastating force over her soul. Then, swallowing a light draught of wine, she sought her son. He lay quiescent upon the couch, as he had lain all day after his illness of the morning, with his white hand before his eyes. There had been a most exciting interview between him and Mr. Dawn, and he was now temporarily, utterly worn out and exhausted. The unhappy mother sat down by her son and ran her slender fingers caressingly through the soft, clustering locks of his abundant hair. She saw his pale face writhe with a spasm of inward feeling as he muttered through trembling lips, "Are they gone?" She answered evasively, "Yes." Chapter 20. Love and Loss. Meanwhile, Everard Dawn flung himself into a cab and hurried to the theater, his mind divided between thoughts of his daughter and the magnificent woman he had left behind him. Arrived at the theater, he purchased a ticket and entered just as the last act was being performed, but without glancing at the stage he threw a hurried, anxious glance around the glittering horseshoe in search of Cynthia's face. To his surprise and unutterable relief, he presently beheld her fair face and shining hair half hidden behind the sweeping curtain in a private box, from which she watched the stage with kindling eyes of delight. Quickly he made his way to her side, and she glanced around at him with suddenly gloomy eyes of fear and dislike. Bending over her, he whispered agitatedly, "Cinthia, do not look at me so coldly and angrily. I am your father." "You do well to remind me of your claim," she answered bitterly, turning her glance back to the stage. The keen reproach cut deep, and for a moment he found no words for reply, only followed her eyes to the scene where Madame Ray, magnificently beautiful in white brocade and diamonds, was the center of an emotional scene. "What a fascinating woman! It is the star, of course," he exclaimed. "Yes, it is Madame Ray. She is more than fascinating. She is an angel," his daughter returned warmly. "May I ask how long you have known the lady?" Cinthia looked around at him and answered, perversely, "Long enough to love her better than anyone else that I know." "Is she so charming?" "Adorable." "And Mrs. Varian?" anxiously. "I hate her," Cinthia answered frankly with a flash of the eyes. "Because she parted you from Arthur?" he asked anxiously. "Yes," mutinously. "Ah, Cinthia, in that act she only showed you truest kindness." "She hated my mother." "And with good reason," he replied, with a transient flash in his dark blue eyes. Cinthia looked suddenly curious. "I should like to hear all about it," she exclaimed. "Ah, my child, it is too sad a story for your ears, that old feud. I pray heaven you need never hear it all. We will go away tomorrow and bury the dead past forever," he answered earnestly, while he wondered over and over how she had formed Madame Ray's acquaintance, though he saw that in her present perverse mood she would disclose nothing. They both watched the stage in silence for some moments. Then she startled him by saying, "I believe my kind friend Madame Ray will help me to become an actress if I insist upon it. Would you consent?" "Certainly not. I have other plans for you," he answered with instant decision. "But I cannot bear the idea of that boarding school. I give you fair notice that I am likely to run away from it and drown myself."
Poor Cinthia, poor unhappy child.
And his voice grew suddenly deep and tender, while he gazed with dim eyes at her flushed, defiant face. A great pity and sympathy rose in his heart for the hapless girl whose life was blighted in its dawning by a hopeless love. He said to himself that he must rise superior to the self-absorption of years and give time and thought to brightening his daughter's life. Perhaps she might turn out more lovable than he had ever dared hope, but even if not, there was his neglected duty staring him in the face. He could not shirk it any longer, now that Cinthia had cut adrift from the old life, and had no one to depend on but him. He must win her from the despair and desperation of her present mood to contentment with life. Speaking very gently and kindly, he said, "If you think you cannot endure the school, I must make other plans for you. How would you like to travel a while?" Her dark eyes gleamed with sudden interest, and she cried quickly, "It would please me more than anything else you can offer. I tell you frankly that I am wretched, and that change of scene and constant excitement offer the only panacea for my troubles." "You shall have it, and I pray heaven it may effect a cure. Listen, Cinthia, I have very agreeable news for you." She looked at him with a slightly incredulous air, and he continued, "A relative of ours has recently left you a small fortune that will enable you to lead a very pleasant future life according to your own wishes. I am appointed your guardian, and you will have an income of 10,000 a year." "10,000 a year!" gasped Cinthia, in surprise and delight at her good luck, for it seemed a great fortune to one who had been reared so plainly and frugally. She was young and beautiful, and always longed for the pleasures that money could buy, and the sudden news that she was to realize her dream did indeed dazzle her so that a smile came to her sad lips and a flash of pleasure to her eyes. Her father thought cynically, "Her sorrow did not lie so deep after all, and it will be easily soothed by the gewgaws foolish women prize. Well, I am glad that it is so." He resumed cordially, "I am glad of this good luck for you, Cinthia, for I have never been rich myself, and my income has never been more than half what yours is now, and that was earned by diligent practice at the law. I had intended to do my best toward brightening your sad young life, but this legacy comes most opportunely to enable you to gratify your desires." "Yes, I am very grateful for it. Now I can seek constant diversion to drown memory," she answered with a long-drawn sigh that showed him she would not forget so easily as he had hoped. It did not occur to her to ask the name of the relative who had left her so handsome a legacy, or to notice that her father had not spoken of anyone's death. In her eagerness she accepted her good fortune without curiosity, and clasping her little hands in growing excitement, cried, "Papa, I have always wished to cross the sea. Will you take me?"
"Yes, Cynthia, but should you not see something of your own land first?"
"That can wait, Papa. My first wish is to put the whole breadth of the world between me and Arthur Varian."
"Perhaps that will be best,"
he assented, for her words touched an aching chord in his own heart. Who could know better the aching pangs of love and loss than Everard Dawn, who had tasted both to the bitter dregs? And how could he blame anyone for the mad instinct of flight from memory when he had been a restless exile weary years for no better reason? "And I have wandered far away to quell my spirit's wild unrest, from place to place a lovely one, and rocked on ocean's heaving breast. But in the sounds of winds and waves, for evermore I heard thy tone, gazed down the mountain's verdant slope, and thought of thee, and thee alone. The eyes whose sparkling light I loved shone on me from the midnight stars. The crimson of the lips once kissed glowed in the sunset's rosy bars." The curtain fell to the crash of orchestra music, and the crowded building began to be emptied and the lights turned low. Both rose, and Cynthia's father said abruptly,
"Shall we return to the hotel, or would you like to go on to New York tonight to get ready for sailing on the first steamer?"
"We will go to New York tonight, but first let me go and say farewell to my dear friend Madame Ray," she said, hurrying to the green room. Everard Dawn went out and sent a note to Mrs. Varian, while he waited for his daughter. It ran simply, "I found Cynthia at the theater, and we go on at once to New York to sail this week for Europe by her earnestly expressed wish. In change of scene and the rush of excitement, she will seek oblivion of this painful episode in her life. E.D." Presently Cynthia came to him from Madame Ray's dressing-room, where she had spent a long half-hour, and her father saw that the dew of tears hung heavily on the thick fringe of her dark lashes. Wondering greatly at this mysterious friendship, he drew her hand through his arm and led her away to the new life that lay before her in the untried future.